There are moments when the mind grows quiet in ways that feel unfamiliar, not empty, not peaceful in the way stories describe, just less crowded. In those moments, something subtle becomes noticeable. Not a new thought, not a breakthrough. A soft absence of the constant pressure to define, to predict, to protect. It can feel almost weightless, and slightly unsettling, because so much of a life has been spent inside mental rooms that were never consciously chosen, beliefs inherited, fears absorbed, stories repeated so often they began to sound like truth. And yet beneath all of that noise, something else has always been present. Not louder, not stronger, just quieter. A sense that the mind, when unburdened, does not collapse. It opens, not into certainty, not into control, but into possibility. There's a particular kind of tiredness that does not come from effort, not from long days, not from lack of sleep. It comes from carrying an inner atmosphere that rarely changes. A sense that the same thoughts circle the same emotional terrain over and over, even when the outer world shifts. From the outside, everything may appear functional. Conversations happen, responsibilities are met, life moves forward. But somewhere beneath the surface, there can be a quiet awareness that something inside feels smaller than it once did. Not broken, compressed. As if the inner world has slowly been furnished with rules instead of space. Most people do not remember when they first began to sense this. It does not arrive as a dramatic moment. It appears as a faint internal contraction, a hesitation before speaking, a second thought before wanting, a subtle pause before imagining. Over time, these pauses accumulate. They begin to feel normal, not restrictive, not oppressive, just how things are. The mind becomes a place where certain thoughts move freely, and certain thoughts rarely arrive at all. Not because they are impossible, but because they no longer feel available. It can be difficult to describe this experience with language. It is not exactly hopelessness, not exactly sadness, not even exactly dissatisfaction. It is closer to a quiet narrowing, like walking through a familiar hallway and not noticing that the walls have slowly moved closer together. There's still enough space to move, enough space to breathe, enough space to function, but less room to stretch, less room to wander, less room to imagine without friction. Sometimes this narrowing shows itself through comparison, watching others speak with ease, create without apology, change directions without long internal negotiations, and feeling something unnamed stir inside, not jealousy in the sharp sense. More like recognition, a faint sense that something once felt more fluid, more open, even if the memory of that openness no longer has a clear shape. Other times it appears in moments of quiet, late at night, early in the morning, in the spaces between obligations. A thought begins to rise, then quickly adjusts itself, softens, shrinks, becomes more reasonable, more realistic, more acceptable. And the original impulse disappears so quickly it is hard to tell it ever existed. What remains is not distress. What remains is familiarity. The mind learns its own boundaries by touching them. Again, and again, and again. Over time, those boundaries stop feeling like barriers. They start feeling like edges of reality, as if the world itself only extends so far, as if imagination has a natural ceiling, as if possibility has always been this size. This is not experienced as oppression. It is experienced as adulthood, as maturity, as practicality, as being grounded. And in many ways, these qualities are valuable. They help life remain stable, predictable, coherent. But alongside stability, something else often grows quietly. A background sense of containment, not dramatic enough to demand attention, not painful enough to demand change, just present enough to be noticed in rare, unguarded moments. A feeling that there is more internal space somewhere, even if its location is unclear, even if its shape is undefined. There can be a strange tenderness in this awareness. Not longing in the cinematic sense, not yearning for something specific, just a soft noticing. A sense that the mind as it is currently experienced may not be the only way it has ever been, or the only way it could be. This noticing does not arrive with a plan. It does not bring instructions. It does not even bring language. It arrives as a quiet curiosity that does not know what it is curious about. A subtle internal question that does not yet have words. Something like, is this all the space there is? The question does not demand an answer. It simply lingers, breathing quietly beneath everyday thought, unannounced, unresolved, present. There's a gentle pattern in how inner worlds are shaped, not through single moments, not through one defining event, but through thousands of small experiences that leave faint impressions. Most of these impressions are never consciously recorded. They settle in quietly, like dust, like sediment, like weathering. Early on, the mind begins to notice what seems to invite closeness and what seems to invite distance, which expressions receive warmth, which expressions are met with silence, which questions are welcomed, which questions create discomfort in the room. None of this is processed as data. It is absorbed as atmosphere. A child does not think, this is acceptable, this is unacceptable. The body simply feels, this is safe, this is uncertain, this is warm, this is exposed. Over time, these felt impressions begin to organize inner movement. Some impulses travel outward easily. Others slow down before reaching the surface, not because someone consciously decided to suppress them, but because the nervous system learned which pathways felt smoother, which paths led to connection, which paths led to disconnection. In this way, the mind does not build walls as punishment. It builds them as protection. Not dramatic walls, not visible ones, but soft internal boundaries that say, stay closer to what keeps belonging intact. Drift away from what threatens it. These boundaries often form long before language exists to describe them, before memory can capture them, before identity feels solid. They are older than conscious thought, older than personal narrative, which is why later in life they can feel like part of personality, part of temperament, part of who someone simply is, not as something that happened, but as something inherent. There is a quiet tragedy in this, not in the sense of damage, not in the sense of something being broken, but in the sense that adaptation slowly disguises itself as identity. A person may say, this is just how I am, when what they are actually describing is a long history of subtle accommodations, tiny adjustments made to stay close to safety, tiny contractions made to stay inside belonging. None of these adjustments are wrong. None of them are malicious. They are intelligent. They are compassionate. They are rooted in a deep biological and emotional desire to remain connected. But over time, they accumulate. And what began as sensitivity becomes limitation. What began as awareness becomes narrowing. Not because the mind wanted to shrink, but because it learned that smaller shapes are easier to protect. It is often only much later that this becomes visible. Not through memory, but through contrast. A moment of spontaneous aliveness, a fleeting sense of expansion. A conversation that feels unexpectedly freeing. A creative impulse that briefly forgets to self-edit. These moments can feel surprising, almost foreign. Not because they are new, but because they are unfamiliar. They hint at a wider internal landscape that does not appear often. Not because it is gone, but because it has been visited less frequently. Sometimes when looking back, certain memories take on a different texture. Not as scenes, but as emotional climates. A time when curiosity felt less conditional. When imagination moved faster than evaluation. When desire did not immediately negotiate with consequence. These memories do not feel like better times. They feel like more open times, not more successful, not more joyful. Just less filtered, less shaped, less contained. And alongside these memories, there can be a quiet recognition that the mind did not begin life as a narrow corridor. It began more like a field, not empty, not infinite, but spacious, responsive, unfixed. The narrowing did not happen all at once. It happened through learning, through observing, through adjusting, through surviving ordinary human environments. No villain exists here, no single cause, no person to blame, only a long, slow conversation between the inner world and the outer world. A conversation that prioritized continuity, safety, belonging, and slowly, almost invisibly, traded some openness for stability. This trade was never consciously negotiated. It simply occurred. And now years later, the result is not pain. Not necessarily, it is a shape, an internal shape that feels familiar, predictable, understandable, and occasionally noticeable. Not as suffering, but as a quiet sense that something inside once moved with fewer edges. The mind is often imagined as a place of thought, but it is also a place of movement. A living, shifting system that is constantly sensing, comparing, adjusting. Much of this movement happens beneath awareness, not hidden in a dramatic way, simply operating outside the spotlight of conscious attention. The mind scans for patterns, not in the way a scientist scans, but in the way a body learns where the floor is, through repetition, through feedback, through consequence. It begins to recognize which internal states tend to lead to smooth interactions, which states tend to create friction, which tones of voice soften rooms, which tones tighten them, which expressions invite closeness, which ones create distance. Over time, the mind does something very subtle. It starts favoring certain inner configurations, certain emotional postures, certain thought rhythms, not because they are objectively true, but because they have proven reliable. Reliability feels calming, even when it feels limiting. A predictable inner world can feel safer than an expansive one, because expansiveness contains uncertainty, and uncertainty carries unknown outcomes. So the mind becomes an organizer, not of facts, but of experiences. It arranges internal life in ways that reduce surprise. It quietly edits reality before it reaches conscious awareness. Some thoughts are allowed full volume, some are softened, some are rerouted, some never quite form. This does not happen through decision, it happens through conditioning. Like water gradually shaping stone, no single moment carves the canyon, but the canyon still forms. From the inside, this editing process feels like personality, like temperament, like preference. It feels natural, unchosen, obvious, which is why it rarely gets questioned. If a thought does not appear, it is easy to assume it does not exist. If an impulse feels faint, it is easy to assume it was never strong. If an idea dissolves quickly, it is easy to assume it was never viable. But beneath this apparent naturalness, a quiet tension often lives. Not loud, not urgent, a background hum. On one side, there is the part of the mind that values continuity, that wants things to remain recognizable, predictable, stable. On the other side, there's something more diffuse, less defined, a subtle pull toward novelty, toward openness, toward uncharted inner territory. This pull does not always express itself as desire. Often it appears as restlessness or boredom, or a vague sense of dissatisfaction that does not attach to anything specific. Not dissatisfaction with life circumstances, not dissatisfaction with people, more like dissatisfaction with internal atmosphere. As if the air inside feels slightly stale, even when everything outside appears fine. The mind does not experience this as a philosophical dilemma. It experiences it as mild friction, small hesitations, micro-conflicts, moments where a thought arises and is immediately countered by another thought. A feeling arises and is quickly explained away. An impulse appears and is quickly contextualized. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just quiet negotiation. Most of the time, the negotiating part wins. Not through force, through habit, through familiarity, through repetition. But the other side does not disappear. It lingers as potential. Not loud enough to demand attention, not clear enough to define, just present enough to be sensed. This coexistence can feel confusing. How can something feel both fine and constrained? How can life feel both functional and incomplete? The mind does not frame it as a paradox. It simply carries both experiences simultaneously, often without language, often without conscious acknowledgement. And because nothing is obviously wrong, nothing appears to need fixing. Yet the subtle awareness remains, a sense that thought itself might be narrower than it once was, not in intelligence, not in capacity, but in range. As if the mind walks the same familiar paths so often that the undergrowth has grown over the others. They still exist, but they are no longer obvious, no longer easy, no longer well lit. This realization, when it surfaces, does not feel like discovery. It feels more like remembering something without knowing what is being remembered. a faint internal echo, not pointing to a destination, not offering direction, just suggesting that the landscape of the mind may be wider than what is currently being traveled. At some point, something small begins to shift, not in the sense of a breakthrough, not in the sense of clarity, more like a change in how attention rests. Thoughts still appear, patterns still repeat, the familiar inner rhythms continue, but occasionally there's a tiny gap, so brief it is easy to miss, a moment where a thought is noticed as a thought, not argued with, not believed, not rejected, simply noticed. This noticing does not arrive with commentary. It does not announce itself. It does not say, something important is happening. It feels ordinary, almost insignificant, and yet something about it is different. The thought still exists, but it does not feel identical to the one who is noticing it. Not separate in a dramatic sense, not distant, just not fused. Like watching a leaf float past instead of being carried by the current. The current still moves, the river still flows, but awareness is no longer only inside the water. This does not make the mind silent. It does not stop patterns. It does not erase history. The inner landscape remains complex, conditioned, layered, human, but the relationship to that landscape begins to soften, very subtly, very gradually. There can be moments when a familiar limiting story appears, a quiet statement about what is possible, about what is realistic, about what kind of person exists here, and alongside it something else is present. Not opposition, not rebellion, not affirmation, just space. Enough space for the story to exist without immediately becoming the entire sky. It still matters, it still influences, but it is no longer the only atmosphere. This space does not feel like freedom in the cinematic sense. It does not feel euphoric, it feels neutral, plain, almost underwhelming, which is part of why it often goes unnoticed. There is no emotional spike to mark it, no internal fireworks, just a slight reduction in density, a barely perceptible loosening. The mind continues doing what minds do, predicting, categorizing, evaluating, protecting. None of this stops. None of this needs to stop. But there is a growing sense that these movements are movements, processes, not definitions, not absolute truths, not permanent structures. This understanding does not arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as a felt shift, a subtle change in weight, as if thoughts carry the same content, but slightly less gravity. And with that slight change, something else becomes possible. Not specific possibilities, not visions, not goals, but a different quality of inner experience. A sense that experience itself is more spacious than previously assumed. Not because anything new has been added, but because something has been recognized. That the mind's contents are not identical to the mind's capacity. That stories arise inside something larger than the stories. This does not produce certainty. It does not produce confidence. It does not produce answers. It produces a gentle humility, a sense of not fully knowing what the mind is capable of. Not in a grand sense, not in a heroic sense, in a quiet, almost mundane sense. The future still feels unknown. The past still feels influential. The present still contains tension, but layered through these experiences is a new undertone. Not optimism, not hope. Something softer. A subtle awareness that inner space exists even when inner weather is turbulent. That possibility is not always something to chase. Sometimes it is simply something that already exists as openness. Unclaimed, undefined. There's no finish line here, no arrival, no final state. The mind does not become permanently open. It did not remain permanently spacious. It contracts, it expands, it forgets, it remembers. Again and again. But perhaps quietly, without ceremony, there's a growing familiarity with the fact that contraction is an experience, not an identity. That narrowing is a state, not a verdict. That openness is not something to achieve, not something to manufacture, but something that occasionally reveals itself in the simplest way, through noticing, and then passes, leaving behind no guarantee, no promise, only a faint imprint, a soft understanding that the shape of the inner world is not fixed, not because it must change, not because it should change, but because it is by its nature alive, and aliveness does not hold still. It moves, It shifts, it opens, it closes, it breathes. And sometimes in the quiet spaces between thoughts, there is the gentle sense that the mind, beneath all of its stories, has always been wider than it believed. Not as a conclusion, not as a claim, just as a feeling, a soft, wordless knowing. That lingers, and then dissolves. Like everything else,